I'm the Assistant Provost for Faculty Appointments, and I have the privilege of introducing our panelists today and moderating the panels. First, just thanks to all of you for being here, both the audience and the panelists. I know you all have very, very busy schedules, and we appreciate your being here. Like Judy and Drew, I'm thrilled to see representation here from across the university. We actually have new faculty members from every school at Harvard. And we hope that you'll benefit not only from the wisdom and experience of the panelists here, but also from your conversations with your colleagues, and that you'll develop a taste for, as Drew and Judy said, reaching out to colleagues across the university in the course of your career here, which we hope will be very long and fruitful. Before I introduce the panel, there are a couple of housekeeping things I have to do. One is, if you have a photo release, if you wanted to have your photo taken by our photographer Susie during one of the breaks, please hand that in to Roba. You'll have that opportunity. I also wanted to mention one of the things that we handed out to you is a kind of a brochure on faculty benefits. I wanted to point out that that's something that is in draft form that we are in the middle of developing, so it might not be the final version of that brochure that you see, so you're getting it first before other people do, but it's a great resource for you to look at benefits across the benefits you'll have access to in all spheres of your life. So the theme of today's panel is Navigating Life as a Scholar at Harvard. And the conversation will no doubt touch on questions that you've been asking yourself, such as how to chart your own course as a scholar, how to manage all the demands on your time, how to identify your goals and priorities and say no to activities that don't support those goals, that's a hard one, how to take advantage of the wide array of resources here at the university, how to balance work life and home life, in particular if you have children. And if you're a new assistant or associate professor, I know we have some new full professors here as well. How does one get tenure at Harvard? So we'll first hear from our associate professor panel, and each panelist will talk for about 10 minutes, and that will leave the second half of the hour for questions and conversations. We want this to be fun and lively, so don't be fooled by the formality of these surroundings. Our distinguished and varied panelists in order are Matt Andrews, Associate Professor of Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, who researches public sector reform, and Pringle, Associate Professor in the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology in the FAS, who studies the ecology of fungi, Marc Weisskopf, Associate Professor of Environmental and Occupational Epidemiology at the School of Public Health, who researches how environmental factors impact the nervous system. And there's a good deal more information about each of the panelists and their impressive backgrounds in your folders. So let's get started. We'll start with Matt.
Okay. Thank you. It's really good to be here. As introduced, my name is Matt Andrews. I'm not Canadian, I'm South African. When I told my wife that I had to do this, and I said, gee, it's going to be a challenge to get all my thoughts in place for a 10-minute talk, and she said, no, the bigger challenge is convincing people you're a scholar. It's as I thought about it, I think it's actually being at a place like Harvard and look at the variation in the room. It's not actually kind of a silly statement that she made, because I think we are in very different places, and sometimes maybe the strategies for establishing a reputation as a scholar are not always going to be the same. So if what I say is something that doesn't resonate with you, it's my strategy. I haven't got tenure. I haven't established myself as a scholar yet. It may be a failure. But we are all different, and I think that's one of the reasons why Harvard is a great place to come to. I think it's also one of the reasons why it is difficult. It's a big challenge. For me, I think that there are 4 dimensions. So my background, I worked in the South African government in the mid-1990s. I did a couple of years graduate school, did a master's, and then I went and worked with the current president, Jacob Zuma. And after 3 years, I got so frustrated with it. I was a macroeconomist with what I didn't understand about government that I decided to come to the States and learn about government. And then I went and worked for the World Bank for a number of years, and then I came to this job. So in a sense, when I was here, my strategy for being a scholar was kind of like a bad one. Do a bit of education here, go work, do a bit of education, go work, don't write, and then kind of find yourself at Harvard having to produce research that people think is serious. My strategy being at the Kennedy School had 4 dimensions, and the first one was essentially to focus on research, easy. Second one, teaching. And at the Kennedy School, it's not just a degree program, it's also executives. The third was to engage in the school life, which is not only administrative, but is also engaging with people, and I'll talk about that in a second, not only in the Kennedy School, but beyond. And then the fourth was, very importantly for me, to make sure that all of the first 3 things connected to the world of practice. And this is where, my emphasis may be quite different from other people's emphasis. To me, to be an effective scholar, if you're working in a place like the business school, the Kennedy School, requires that there be an impact of your research in fairly short order in the world of practice. And, that is something that I've taken fairly seriously. Now, the difficult thing is that all 4 of those areas are areas where you come into Harvard and you say, well, I'm going to work in these 4 areas, and they all have so many opportunities that someone said to me, it's like drinking from a fire hydrant. You want to teach, here are 10 courses. You want to do research, here are 5 research centers, and we all want to relate to you because we all think you're interesting. So a significant part of it is actually making tough decisions, working out fairly early what you're going to say yes to automatically, and I would say putting a lot of other things on the shelf. Because you don't want to say no to a lot of things until you know about them, but you really want to kind of pull yourself back a little bit. First year I was here, I think I didn't do that terribly well, and I think I ended up probably spending a good 30 to 40% of my time doing things that I wish that I hadn't done now, because I think they didn't really lead me anywhere. They were very interesting and they were a lot of fun. But I think I could have maybe said to them, let me come to a meeting and before I commit myself to that. So one of the things I would recommend to you is, test the waters on everything that looks great. Have coffee with someone who's involved before you commit to be engaged, because there are a lot of things around here and you need to make good decisions. The idea of establishing connections university-wide and even outside of the university is, I think, very, very important. And here, I'm not going to get into the tenure discussion because you'll have it later, but I think, the idea of being part of a community of scholars and a community of people who are thinking about the things that you are thinking about is very important and is taken very seriously at Harvard. And that community needs to go outside of your school and outside of your, even outside of Cambridge. I think, people are looking for that, and it's very important. Doing that is really tough. Because again, now you're kind of saying, well, Harvard is an environment where there's too much to handle. Now I'm going to go and kind of scan the world for people who do what I do. The most important thing for me at Harvard is I've had the same assistant from the day that I got here. And I think within the first year, she got a sense of who I was, and she got a sense of what my priorities are. And she really manages me well. And she really is a gatekeeper for a lot of things that are coming onto my plate or into my door. And she just kind of like stops those things for me. Because I think what she's realized is, there's so many things and so many pieces that I don't really have much control over them. I teach management, but I'm really poorly managed. So the one thing I would say is find yourself a good assistant. It's very important, because there are a lot of emails that come to you. There are a lot of requests that come from inside and outside Harvard. And what Judith said is absolutely true. When people look at me, they'll say, oh, that's very nice. Nice to meet you. And then they'll see Harvard. And suddenly their eyes kind of get all bright, and they start asking me if their kids can come and, if I'll come and visit their governments. And it's great to have someone to help you to manage some of those things and really to kind of move some of the requests that come onto my plate around. I think, I'm already at my 10 minutes. The one thing that I really wanted to emphasize is, I think you have to have the strategy. For me, I have these kind of 4 things that I think about, and I think very seriously about trying to find balance between them. I think research is obviously important, the connection to the real world, and for me, when I go for tenure, I don't know if it's the right thing, but a key thing I want to say is the things that I'm doing are being given attention, and they're changing the way that people are doing practice. And I'm kind of trying to cultivate that story all the time with the work that I do. And but that's a difficult thing to do because it means that my life isn't just about doing the research. My life is about trying to kind of give the research some actual life itself. And that requires time, that requires energy, and that requires kind of really managing what you do. So I do say, I think you need to have a strategy. Don't just say, well, I'm going to write 20 papers and that's the way that it's going to be. Work out what it is that you as a scholar want to define yourself as. And when I say that, I also kind of really think that, you know, it's not just what do they expect me to do to get tenure. This place is a place that can cultivate so many passions inside you, and if you kind of spend your time being defensive and thinking, what do I need to do for someone who's going to say whether I can stay or not, I think you're kind of wasting your time. I think that it really is a place where you can enter with ideas and in 5 years' time have those ideas go way beyond where you thought that they would be. And I would encourage you to kind of open yourself up to that and not to be kind of defensive, but to really be aggressive in finding out what it is that you care about and in cultivating that. Because my sense is whether you get tenure here or not, that's the way to be at Harvard. So that's my 10 to 15 minutes.
I think it'll be interesting for you all to hear what's relevant or what's not relevant, depending on what school you are, because I have some themes that are very similar, and I think some themes that are different. And I also wanted to say, when I started this job, I have 2 daughters. My daughters were 2 and 4 when I started, and so I would open myself up to questions about that now or later. I'm happy to be a resource for how that dynamic plays out over time. So I have some sound bites. I'm going to try to flesh out the sound bites just a little bit, and then you can ask me more if you want to know. My first soundbite is that we should all strive to be independent voices. You should be an independent voice as a scholar. So many of you have worked with advisors or mentors very closely up until this point. My advice is leave it behind. If you need a year to wrap up that work, great. If you just started a system as a postdoc, that's very common in the sciences, and you're taking it with you, make sure you have an explicit understanding with your postdoc mentor that it's your project now and not that person's project any longer. So be aware of how you're being perceived and whether or not you're being perceived as, and whether you are, in fact, thinking independently. And that's my second soundbite is think. It may sometimes seem as if you're wasting your time when you're spending some weeks simply reading other people's scholarship. But what you need to ask yourself is you have some amount of time to solve some problems, to answer some questions. What questions do you want to answer? And I think asking good questions is almost the most difficult challenge. And it's not a waste of time to take space and time to think through what the critical questions are. And now is your moment to do it. I would say these first, this first year, this first set of years. So think is my second soundbite. Travel would be my third soundbite. Travel is part of your job. You need to travel for lots of reasons. You need to travel. It's useful because when you go to meetings, when you go give departmental seminars, you have to articulate what it is you're doing and why. And being forced to articulate that helps you think through. I have to do this all the time. I work with fungi. I work with mushrooms. I have to convince people that mushrooms are actually a reasonable way to spend your time. So all of you, some of you won't have as dramatic a problem potentially as I do, but I think all of you need to be able to say, this is why the work I do is important. The advice I got when I started, which I think is useful, I picked one meeting. I go to that same meeting every year. It's the Mycological Society of America. It's about a 300-person meeting. Everybody knows me there. I know everybody there. They know my work. They'll read my work. And that has been incredibly useful for lots of different kinds of reasons. I take a different strategy when I publish. I try to publish in as many different journals as I can. Science is a huge field, and for me it's become a bit of a game. Where can I sell fungi? That journal doesn't normally think about this group of organisms, but actually it's very relevant to public health. So I'm writing a piece on fungal spores and asthma, for example. So anyway, I just offer it as a strategy. And often if you publish in one place and you often have some citations in something that you publish to other pieces of work that you've published, you can reach multiple audiences that way. So, but traveling is definitely a good thing to do. don't grow too large too quickly. Okay, so the soundbite there is don't work with jerks. Almost everyone has the experience of hiring that disaster postdoc who sucks away all your time because he never shows up in lab and he's just wasting your money. You can avoid that somewhat by staying small initially and growing larger later. Or just being very careful about the people that you let enter your life. And by the way, the don't work with jerks strategy is also relevant for your collaborators. You can very quickly tell when someone is going to suck away your ideas and then use them in some weird way that all of a sudden you realize you're not really a part of that anymore. You're just feeding into someone. So just be careful about that. Don't be afraid of professional development workshops. For me, I'm a very academic, through and through. I don't have much practice associated with my work, and so one of the most interesting experiences I've had at Harvard was when I was sent to a professional development workshop where they analyzed my brain. And it was a very business school approach, and they said, this is how you think, and I kid you not, I had to fill out all these tests, and then they showed this huge panel, and there was my brain as opposed to everybody else's brain. And my brain was very different from everyone else in the room. I was really startled by this. I can't tell you how bizarre. There was nothing in my PhD that related to anything even remotely close to what a business school might consider to be, good skills for someone who's running a large lab. This is a theme in the sciences. And what I took away from that workshop was, it really shook me up, and I really started to ask why it is that in certain interactions they go a particular way, which is, of course, I think, anyway, so don't be afraid of having those bizarre new experiences that then, and you can potentially learn a lot from them. And I guess my last thought, and it's a rather serious one, is that you will make mistakes. Accept that, be flexible, move on with grace. I think it's a bit of a long road actually ahead, and you'll be fine. And you'll be more fine if you just accept that sometimes things aren't going to happen the way that you wanted them to. So we didn't have a new faculty orientation when I started off here, but we did have a chat from a dean named Bill Kirby, and he said something which I've never forgotten, and I'm just going to leave it to you. I don't even know if it was the end or the middle, but he used an ancient saying, and he said to us, just remember this, fall down 6 times, get up 7.
Wow, I don't know where to go after that. That's great. So I have the advantage, I guess, of speaking last here, which means I don't really need to say much because these guys have covered a lot of what I was going to talk about. But I think they raised great points, and I think it's very interesting seeing the similarities across all of this. Just by quick way of background, and public health tends to get a wide variety of people. So I came with a background that I always thought was a little bizarre, but in School of Public Health, people come from all over the place. I did a PhD in neuroscience, lab neuroscience, and sort of slid from there into public health and environmental health, and eventually epidemiology and environmental health, and now I sort of look at a population level rather than a lab level. And I did that coming back to Harvard, so I'm going to talk to you from a perspective, and I guess these guys may or may not have had this, I'm not sure, of having been here for a few years before I actually started as a faculty member. Which gives a slightly different spin because to some extent I knew things from the inside. I got a chance to meet a lot of people and get a lot involved with a lot of things before I actually started my faculty position, which is helpful and can be problematic in other ways. But so with that sort of background, let me also sort of go a little bit along the soundbite line. I think, as is probably obvious to you all, and you all are here at Harvard, so this is something you probably don't need to think about, which is that the real sine qua non here is quality work, which I'm sure you all do. So that's clearly the first thing, and a lot of stuff flows from that. But part of that, as I think was alluded to here, is the idea of it should be fun what you're doing, right? And I totally agree with, I think, Matt saying it's probably a bad idea to think about what you need to do in order to get tenure solely. It's good to have it maybe in the back of your mind a little bit, but if that's really your sole focus, I think that can become problematic and become psychologically difficult after a while. Instead, do your best work and do the things that excite you and you have fun doing, because that's what's going to drive you to do great things, whether it's here or not, right? And in fact, I was on faculty council at the School of Public Health, and the chair was in the what is it, health policy and management department, and he said that the best advice that they gave their young faculty was basically to sort of ignore tenure at Harvard and just say, look, you're going to be the best, best scholar you can be wherever you are, whether it's here or not, and go and do your thing. So with that said, I think I also want to touch on what both of these folks have talked about, and I'm just going to give it a slightly different spin. And it's, again, the idea of your sort of unique contribution, right? So this going around initially and sort of stating in one sentence what you do is great. But what I would encourage you to do, which I imagine you all kind of do anyway, but I would almost encourage you, and in fact, I'm sort of pushing our department this way, to actually on a yearly basis have the junior faculty actually write a few sentences out about why you are unique. What is the thing you're doing that is sort of not just incrementally advancing the field, but why you are substantially different, right? Why are you making a sort of quantum difference in your field? Now, that may evolve, and you may think about it all the time, but I think crystallizing it is good, even if you get it wrong the first few times, and it changes. I think having that in mind is a good thing, not just for a few things I'll talk about for you going down, but I think it's also good for others to hear. So when people in your department are advocating for you, or when they're talking to someone in a different school, to be able to say that and sum it up quickly is very beneficial for them. And they're busy people with a lot of things on their plate. So, keeping a good soundbite for them and feeding it to them is not a bad thing. Part of that also, I think, is that what hopefully flows from that, which these guys have talked about as well, is this idea of what you do get involved with eventually. Because as everyone's going to tell you, and it's an amazing place being at Harvard, there's so much going on, as you can tell from this room, and it is like drinking from a fire hydrant. And that's problematic. That's great, and it's problematic, and it's very difficult to manage. And there's no question in my early years, it was like, it's coming at you like a fire hydrant. And there is the opportunity to get involved in a ton of different things, and I did the same thing, I guess, as Matt. I definitely would say a mistake I made was to do too much in the first year and to not stop and think for a little while about what you really want to do. And I think if you can keep the focus on why you're doing something sort of unique, what is your unique niche and your real sort of quantum contribution to your field, that you can try and stick as best you can to that. And I guess I would also reiterate this idea of part of this may be slowing down in the first year. Yes, have the coffee with that person, find out everything that's involved, but there's time. You don't need to do it all right away. And in fact, the papers in your first year probably aren't going to matter as much as the papers in your third or fourth year, and they'll probably be better papers. So don't worry so much, I guess I would say. So part of that and having coffee with things, the other thing, again, touching on what they've talked about, is really see and be seen, right? The other thing, other than Jesus having a wife that's been on the news a lot lately, at least that I've heard, was this idea that some study, and I have to admit I didn't go back to the original literature, on what really gets you ahead in the workplace. And they said what gets you ahead in the workplace is bragging. Now, I'm not going to advocate that here at all, and in fact, I don't like it when people brag, and I think you have to, I think that's, especially I think in academic circles, you got to be careful of that. On the other hand, you do have to be seen and have people know what you're doing. And in fact, Judy mentioned it in her remarks about getting out so that the rest of the university knows you too. It's very important to do that within Harvard. It's also very important, as Ann was talking about, to do that at outside meetings, and that is absolutely critically important, certainly in my field, that you need people outside the university to know who you are, right? If you do want to think about promotion, when people go out and get letters, and someone says, would you write a letter for Marc Weisskopf, and their response is, who is that? That's not a good thing. So you want to get out, get your work out. That doesn't mean just presenting at meetings. It means interacting with the people at the meetings, getting to know them, getting to know their work, not just discussing your work, discussing their work, and go to the same meetings so that you develop this sort of core of people who really know you. So I guess a couple other quick things about the whole drinking from a fire hydrant is really learning to gauge effort was I think in my mind the hardest thing. I I don't know how many of you are in this situation. I'm in a situation where we're essentially grant funded. So the first thing I thought of, and it wasn't any different. I had a career development award when I became faculty, so my salary was covered. But somehow the day I became a faculty member, I was like, oh my God, I have to fund myself. So I was writing grant after grant after grant, and frankly, that's where I wish that Anne had said, stop, think for a little while, don't write all those grants, see what you really want to do. So. Another sort of side correlator to that is that there are a lot of opportunities, at least in my area, for sort of small pilot work, which can be tremendously useful and beneficial to get yourself started, but it can also become a time sink. If they're a little easier to get, which is great, but if you've now got 5 small pilot projects, you're not doing the big stuff that you really need to do. So you want to be careful about that. And 2 last points I'll end with. The issue about you're going to make mistakes, absolutely. The thing I would add to that too is learn from them. Everything you do, you should learn something from it. Don't make it a lost cause. You realize what works and what doesn't work and take that away. And the second thing I would do is that I actually haven't taken these hints myself yet. I'm trying to, but I would recommend that this business of sorry, this is a point that I missed. Let me get back and I'll come to this. The issue of collaboration versus independence also is a difficult one. For me, having been at Harvard, it made it a little bit more difficult because I was already integrated with a bunch of people, and to try and then separate out my stuff from them was tough. So I basically tried to sort of start things very new from the beginning, and that was something that I really had in my mind from day one, and I think I would totally encourage you to do that. Now, it's not a bad idea to keep some, if you've got some things going, to keep them, because another thing that's useful is to have some stuff going that maybe is easily productive. Maybe it's not the hottest stuff, but you can be reasonably productive without a whole lot of effort, so you can put more of your effort into really getting your stuff that's yours going alone. And that will come into play when you're dealing with collaborations versus independence with folks. You want to, you do want to get some stuff out. You want people to know you. You want to work with them, but keep time for yourself. And then so the last thing on that is that once you do start doing your own thing, think about after a little while, if there's a good opportunity for, say, a review paper on your sort of topic, so that 1, you'll cite a lot of your own stuff, but 2, people start to see that you are the person for that, right? So that sort of begins to tag you as the person to go to for that thing. So I guess I would leave it at that and just thank all you guys for letting me talk here.
Thank you. That was terrific. One thing that that none of you commented on, and I'm wondering before we open it up for questions, if you would, is how you balance your time between your teaching obligations and your research. What does that split of time look like for you? I know it's going to vary from school to school. So.
Yeah, I teach 1 course a semester. I teach 1 course in the fall, and then I teach a module in the spring. One of the things that is tough for me is that all of my work requires a significant amount of travel to Africa for me, and I'm testing really stupid theories about high-level interaction on a routine basis, making a difference in change. So I literally have to go to Mozambique once a month. So teaching is a problem for me. So I teach on Monday nights from 4 till 7, and then I get on an aeroplane at 10 o'clock on Monday, and then I'm back next Monday morning. So I try and work it around that. But one course semester is what I do. I teach some executives in June. I think in the Kennedy School, one of the things you have to watch is there's a lot of executive teaching, and it can take up your whole summer, and I think some people find that happens to them. So I teach 1 course every year, the same course, first 3 weeks of June, and I haven't had to do any new materials for that for 3 years. So I think that's kind of one of the ways in which I manage that time.
So yeah, actually, it doesn't just vary by school, it even varies by department within schools. So my teaching load is probably pretty low, I would guess, on the average, although I guessing in GCD at the School of Public Health, it might be even lower. Although, as we advocate all the time, that there's teaching and then there's teaching. So there's classroom teaching, and then there's a lot of teaching you're doing with your postdocs and your trainees on a one-on-one basis, which is extremely important as well. As far as classroom teaching, I co-teach 2 classes, and so overall that's like 1/4 of a student's load in a semester, and I put them both in the spring just because it does take time. But I also, once you've done it a couple of years, it tends to go a little bit faster. But it's tricky. You got to do it, and I also find that it's good to have students see you, and then the good ones often or sometimes will come and work with you, which is a good thing. But it's tricky. I mean, there's obviously balance, and you need to do some, but it can take away from research time, and can be a difficult thing to manage.
There's a program here called the Freshman Seminar Program, and it's a fantastic way to teach. The freshmen, I used to teach high school, and the freshmen are kind of everything the best about Harvard students. They're so bright, they're so open, it's so much fun, and I guess. And as far as the time management goes, so I would highly recommend that everyone look into the Freshman Seminar Program. It's pretty great. And as far as the time management goes, it is worth it the first year you teach any course to spend a lot of time on it. You'll find it takes a disproportionate amount of your time to prepare. But if you prepare that first time well and you archive very carefully your materials, then the next time you teach it, at least for me, science moves quickly, and so I'm constantly updating. There's always something new to add and something new to say, but the core materials are there. And so the burden of time does get easier, which then the next bit of advice is pick the courses you want to teach carefully and maybe teach them again and again for a while, rather than teaching new courses every few years.
Thank you. So now let's have a much broader conversation. I hope some of you have questions for our panelists. Who's going to please go first?
So I have a question about sort of tactics of publishing. So in basic sciences, where frequency of publication is much lower than social sciences, the higher impact papers tend to take quite a long time to get data from. When you start off, which you say is a more priority, are this quickly showing evidence or to come in kind of benchmark and all that to be? So, to get that kind of nature paper might take 2 years or 3 years. So you can wait until you come into your first independent publication and start selling the tone of your lab. Or you might have like a smaller project which you can publish quickly and might have less impact and get yourself out of the independent. I'm not sure about balance. It's lots of things that don't postdoc which you can publish, as you sit and kind of hold out and not publish and kind of come in.
Get everything done out from your postdoc now. Take the next 6 months and just get it done. Because if you don't get it done now, it's not going to happen. It's probably not going to be as relevant. There isn't a right answer to that question. Different fields are really different. So for example, if you're a neuroscientist, it's quite common to have a very low publishing rate. Maybe 1 paper a year is quite a lot because the experiments are really difficult. Other fields, experimental evolution, a lot of publications every year are more normal. Theory, a lot of publications every year are more normal. I think, and then I have a bit of a Pollyanna response. I wouldn't think about it that way. I would think about what's the important question that you're going to answer. If you've really answered that important question, it's going to go somewhere great. And so whether answering that important question takes 6 months or 2 years, I can't answer for you. But start with the question and then let that be your guide, because important questions go good places.
So if you have leftover, I have leftover some proposal, so that might be hard. So you could publish it, might not be that high impact, then you might publish it mental. I don't mind just not publishing it, focusing on that key question, but that might take longer to get.
You have a little time at the beginning. So I would say if there were ever a moment in your career where you were going to go for it, now is the time to go for it. And you have time to readjust if a year down the line you realize that figuring out whether fungi are immortal or not is not an easy problem to solve over the course of, that's true, actually. It's one of my research fields. So it just is on very long time scales. So you have time, and I would say, I don't know, I would encourage, I mean, I think go for it, you know? You're here, you got resources, you've got amazing people around you, you can attract amazing people to your lab, you know, no time like the present, definitely.
Yeah.
So if you think there's a potential to spend 2 years and get a blockbuster Nature paper, absolutely go for it, yeah.
I mean, just this issue of getting the right question, I think that cuts across fields, because, I mean, we're in completely different worlds, and I think that it's absolutely vital, and if, I think maybe what you need to do is kind of realize also that, you know, getting things out is not just about publishing, it's also about going to conferences, it's also, you know, it's also about putting, you know, there are other ways of communicating with people, and I think one of the things that maybe is a good strategy in the first few years is communicating your work in a way that generates some answers about what are the questions that people really care about. Because when you get those big papers, you don't want to get a fabulous paper that people say that's a fabulous paper, but it's a really boring topic. So I really think you need to kind of spend that time and maybe think it's not just about kind of getting, you know, articles out. It really is about doing all the things that we've been speaking about in a manner that helps you by the year 2 or by the year 3 to have some research project that is in place that is actually tackling a question that people are really going to care about. So when the articles start to flow, they're reading them, they're citing them, and it's kind of getting you out there. I think it's very important.
Go.
Question that might be too particular, so let me know. The question that I have is actually about navigating the student labor market in terms of trying to find research assistants. I feel like more senior professors, I was going to say older, old person. So I kind of have a sense of the informal labor market, they know their colleagues, they know how to find things, but you are in a position where you need to kind of get up and running quickly. You could find yourself, I don't want to work with jerks. And I want to make sure that I can quickly figure out where the students are, how to kind of get a sense of how good they are fairly quickly. And I would just love to hear any experiences you've had here at Harvard in particular about how to navigate the student labor market and manage it.
Teaching is a great way to find bright, interesting students who care about what you're doing, because if they're doing well in your class, they probably care about things you care about.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that too. I've found people through students, through talking at the school, and actually also with other faculty. They'll have people come to them and they don't have a spot, and so they pass them on. But it is tricky. I mean, I don't think I'm yet at the point where I'm really great at completely vetting somebody and knowing that I'm getting exactly what I'm getting. But there are great students here, and so I would have them know you and be very interactive with them so that they're totally comfortable coming up at the end of your lecture and saying, hey, that was great, can I do something with you?
I mean, I think the struggle that I've had with students is get, you know, we talk about us managing our time so that we're productive. I think you get a lot of really smart students who commit to help you on things, and basically they were overcommitting in themselves. And I think over time, one of the things that I've really focused on a lot is making sure that that student is actually going to be able to do the things that I'm asking that student to do, given all the other things they're doing. So when I was talking, I was mentioning my assistant, and she's really good at kind of working that out for me. So before I hire someone, I generally have them sit with my assistant, and you know they have to anyway with all the forms. But at the end of it, I sit with my assistants and say, tell me a little bit about kind of how they talk about managing themselves. And she'll say, don't hire this person. Because I think that's been my biggest struggle. I've had really good students who I think have really wanted to work with me, and they don't always kind of carry it through.
You know, sort of along those lines, I think I might add too, and I'm this may not necessarily just be sort of research assistants, but also potentially students that might do theses or something with you. I've tended to get them through knowing them they've already been at the school and they've been doing stuff, and they come to me or I find them. But I have noticed that at least in our school, and I don't know what it is in yours, that it can potentially be advantageous to be on, for example, admissions committees. Because I sort of noticed that the very good students tend to go to the people on the admissions committees, and frankly, they see them first, and so that's, they not just they could also potentially be RAs, but in terms of students. And I would also reiterate this point that the students themselves are great. I mean, I've had a couple one in particular, really good student who does her doctoral dissertation with me, but she, heads so much of what's going on in my group because they're that capable. And there are those students here, obviously. And so finding them can be a huge benefit to your work group.
Depending on how formal your my academic training wasn't as formal as some other people's academic training, and so this is going to sound remarkable to I think many people in this room. Interviewing was something that it hadn't occurred to me before how important an interview is, and interviewing and asking creative questions. So when I hired my first technician, one of the questions I asked everybody that I interviewed was, "You're in the lab. A graduate student is complaining because a computer program isn't working at the moment when you're trying to get a PCR set up and a glass of glacial acetic acid falls on the floor. What do you do?" And you could really tell that some people were very startled by that question. It was too much reality television, and other people were willing to roll with it. And I it was that was the question that helped me define who was going to be okay and who wasn't going to be okay. And anyway, since that moment, it's been pretty critical for me, if I don't already know the person, to undergo a very formal interview process. And then we can move on to the kind of regular dynamic of the lab when that person is brought in. But at first, it's very, very formal.
So it sounds like there's largely an informal labor market for almost everyone to this program.
No, I've had if I understand you correctly, I've been a part of I've had, advertised internationally, had 100 applicants, winnowed it down to 10, interviewed 5, brought 2 in onto campus for an on-campus interview. I've definitely, but that's not for undergraduates. And I'm sorry, I miss, I thought you were asking about undergraduate students. And
I was thinking more so about graduate students.
yeah. For graduate students, I keep it very formal until they're in. Yeah.
Other questions? I should mention this segment of conversation is not being taped, unlike the panel, so don't be shy. Yeah.
Maybe a question for those who are published less in your fields. I listed my research projects the other day, and in my field we published perhaps 1 per year. And I came up with 13 projects, which I want to kill at least 4. Now, not all of them, or most of them are with co-authors. How do you approach that conversation to tell them, folks, I want to get out of this?
The graceful no is an art
Yeah.
that everyone has to learn. And I think one thing that can help is if you're honest and say, look, I'm starting out, I need to establish myself as an independent scholar, I need to make careful choices. And you don't actually have to say that you're never going to do it. You just have to say, for the moment, this can't be my priority. Maybe it can be my priority in a few years, but right now, or next year, but it can't be my priority now. And I think that's one way to handle it.
I mean, I think for me, the first thing I did also was just kind of made it clear to myself why I wanted to say no, so that when I got into the tough conversation and they tried to pressure me to not say no, I knew exactly why I was not there. That's why I kind of said, here are my 4 kind of areas of strategy. Here are the things I'm doing in those different areas. And that already puts me at 300% of my time. So then I went back and cut it again and went back and cut it again. So when I was saying no to people and they said, no, but you can fit it in, I was like, I really absolutely cannot, And I think that, a graceful no, but at the same time, a very firm no with the reason and saying, look, I've actually looked at my time. I'm not just saying this. I cannot do it. I think we'll get you past at the end. And I think it happens a lot. So I don't think you need to feel terribly bad that you're saying no about doing things, because I think it is a reality that people deal with. It sounds to me that you probably have to cut more things, though, which is the tough reality. I think saying no to ourselves is sometimes harder than saying no to other people. at least for me.
I completely agree with all this, and I would add also, if you're, if at some point you're not comfortable just saying no in that way, I would also, and this is probably just in general a good thing to do, is try and identify some mentors if it's not formal already in your department or school, and go to them, sort of lay out your situation, and often you can use them. They will say, go to the person and tell them, I said you're doing too much and you can't do it, and you're really sorry, you'd love to, but you're being given very strong guidance not to.
It seems to me that perhaps the most important thing to do is to focus on a narrow, but very relevant research question and try to guide your efforts towards that. And I'm curious just to know what's the process that you have followed to identify what the most relevant questions are that you want to focus on.
I mean, I think it is a good strategy, but it wasn't where I started because I didn't have the question. And I think that's the thing, is the first part of the strategy is find good questions. And so, I don't think you start, I personally didn't start with kind of a very narrow agenda. I did start with something that was fairly broad, but that didn't mean that I started with like 15 commitments. I started, going to meetings, engaging with colleagues, trying to build that community. The key thing for me is I don't really relate to a field. So, everyone's speaking about my field, this. I don't really have a field. So that's a challenge that some people will have here, is try to work out, who is my field. And so I think spending a little bit of time, I really like the idea that Anne was saying, spend some time, read other people's work. I would say in the first couple of years, maybe really go to a bunch of conferences. Try and find out people whose questions intrigue you. And I think in that way you get there maybe by your second or third year. And at that point you kind of get ready to commit yourself to a more focused agenda. So I would say, that's the thing, is really spread yourself a little bit, but not spreading your work, just spreading yourself, so that kind of, you're thinking, you're reading, you're engaging, so that you can find those questions.
Yeah, I've sort of had two things that I've kind of tried to keep in mind, but again, it probably took me 3 years before I really crystallized this, and so didn't put it into action right away. But I'm at a little bit at an advantage having come out of laboratory neuroscience and entering epidemiology, because that's sort of not something that anybody else in the school seems to have. So that creates almost automatically a bit of a niche for me, that I can do neurological stuff. Now, it's not that nobody else does it, but that just helps me do things that are a little different from other people, and so they identify me as sort of this neuro person. So finding something where you bring something somewhat novel to the table is definitely a good thing to do. The other thing in terms of the epidemiology, and epidemiology could be applied to many things. What I've tried to keep in mind is all of this with a background of I have to be very interested in the question, and it has to be something I really want to do. But I've tried to say, all right, if there are a choice of things, is there a question I can ask where I have the opportunity to bring to it something that's just very different than whatever the field has been doing before, right? So as I do a lot of research on ALS, and without going into the details of all of this, it's a rare disease which sort of limits the kinds of ways you can study it. And so I've actually found several opportunities to take an entirely different approach than that typical study design. And that sort of wasn't something people were doing before because it was too difficult. But if you either search for or happen upon a scenario where you can do something like that, that just creates something that's easy to tell somebody, here's why what I'm doing is really different from everybody else. And so if a question like that pops up and it's interesting to me, I definitely would focus on that.
And I think this is where having trusted colleagues is really valuable, because once you've identified what it is that you'd really like to do, having to articulate that for other people and getting feedback before you launch into the experiments or research equivalent, that can force you to think even more critically, and you can sense people's reactions, whether they're excited or not excited, and so it can be, that's another thing to do.
I was hoping you could comment on service commitment, so serving in different committees and working groups, both internally and externally outside the university. And this might differ by school, but how much of it to do, how do you go about choosing which committees to be
All right, I'll take a stab at it. I mean, so you do have to do some of that, certainly within the school, and you don't have to do it outside of the school, but it actually can be quite good to do it outside the school. Yeah, there are many ways you can do it. I guess one thing I would say that I try and keep in mind is if there's one that there's an opportunity to be on or someone asks me, I do sort of, on those things in particular, I really want to think, well, sort of what's in it for me kind of thing. And there are many committees, and there's some that are going to be a lot more work and less relevant for you. I think you want to do it in the school because you do want the other people in the school to know who you are, and you want to know what you want to be interacting with them on a more personal level, so they know what you're doing. To the extent that you can do ones that are a little less heavy lifting, I would definitely do that. Or, for example, the admissions committee, because you think, I'm going to get something out of this because I'm going to see the best students, and that's going to help. But I would definitely recommend to try and keep that, to a minimum. I wouldn't go too big, and I hope mentors would help guide you that way. Somebody once said about anything that, in terms of this managing what you should do, that, when someone calls you to do whatever it is, whether it's community or something else, you ask yourself, would you do it next Tuesday? And if the answer is no, just say no matter when they're asking you to do it, because next Tuesday, it will eventually be next Tuesday. And as far as outside the university, I enjoy doing that, and that's part and parcel of this getting out and seeing and being seen. So I've done some Institute of Medicine committees that it's very good. You're asked to be on them. You interact with a wide variety of people that are sort of in semi-related areas. It's good to know them. You get to know them both scientifically and personally. I try and keep it to a minute. I don't think I'd ever do more than one at a time, for example. But I think it's definitely worth it. It's part of that getting out there and being seen. And these people in the end may be people that wind up writing letters for you. So it's a good thing to do.
I mean, I think, my sense is that when you say no to these things, especially internal ones, you really need to be very graceful in that no as well, because these are people, these are your colleagues, whether they are administrative colleagues or faculty members. At the same time, I think you have to say no a lot, because, people see you coming and they think this would be fantastic. Sometimes they're being very collegial and they're thinking, gee, it would be nice to have something once a week or once every 2 weeks where I could see this person. And so I think you need to look at those. But I do think one of the things that it took me a year to work out was that there were things that actually I could get my points for that actually I really wanted to do. And were, I ended up for 3 years organizing the faculty research lunch. It's fabulous. Every Wednesday, I would organize the speakers, and I would send the emails out, and I would engage. So, by my 4th year, pretty much everyone at the Kennedy School knew who I was, which is quite an achievement. But I only found that because at the end of the first year, I sat down with the academic dean and said, could I negotiate what I'd do next year, and could you kind of give me a list of things? And I found on that list that there were some things that I would choose to do next Tuesday, and I was kind of attending all of them anyway. But the other thing I would say is when you're on the committees, I think you also need to manage the engagements that you have while you're there. So I find with admissions committees, for example, I think they're great to be on. But I also find that sometimes, they have 100 meetings and I really only need to be at 10 of them. And I'm not saying kind of like, fob them off and don't go to things you need to be at, but you'll learn after a while that there are a bunch of process meetings that you don't really need to be at. Someone will help you to make sense of that stuff. So even when you kind of have the commitments, you still then need to manage kind of the time that you allocate to it. And there's still space to say no to some of the activities that come along with some of these committee activities.
Nice. Yes, please.
Thanks for your presentations. One of the questions that I have for all of you is how you make decisions around engaging with practice and policy and the kinds of requests that might come from governments or policymakers or kind of outside of university service, but service to the public, which often I think works in line with the research agenda, but not always. And just how to manage that, especially early in the career of that as a researcher.
It's very hard. I did it very poorly for about 4 years, and I think I paid quite a big price. And now I don't do anything that doesn't have to do with my research. And I think part of it was when I came here, I didn't get the whole Harvard effect. That people want you because you're at Harvard, you can pretty much get to do anything in the world of practice if you kind of position yourself well enough. So I would say before you commit to do things in that world, think about exactly where you want to be, exactly what you want to do, and you motivate those things. Requests that come for me to do things, I've kind of worked out ways to move those around the school, so because you do want them to get answered. You do want, if there are practical issues and if there are people who need help, you want them to get that help. But the problem is you get engaged with the practical matter somewhere else, and the next year you've been working there for 3 years. And so I just think the cost is pretty significant if you don't manage that really, really tightly. And even if you're getting requests and at the beginning you don't know what you want, so you find yourself saying no a lot. At the beginning I thought, gee, what happens if they stop asking? They won't. They're just going to ask more. So, like I would say, I think probably the best advice I think here is when Anne said, if you're spending time not doing that stuff and reading and thinking, and that's probably a good measure of whether you're spending your first couple of years well. If you're spending all of your time on aeroplanes going and doing practical work that you don't see any connection with research, that's not a good thing. At the same time, the question about how do you find good questions. At the end of the day, I found my good questions from a lot of those practical things. That's how they emerged for me, and that's how my research sites have emerged as well.
Let me just add to that, because I think that's critical too. At some of these outside committees, for example, outside of the school, I've tried to pick ones that are close to my field. Partly they're calling you for that anyway, so it's not likely to be terribly far. But not only does that help limit the amount of work, because you probably, for example, know a lot of literature already, but often you will discover things that are quite helpful for you. And almost every committee I've been on, I've found an opportunity to do a line of research that I hadn't realized before. That's just come out of the fact that I've had to survey a lot of literature. So when you keep them reasonably, in contrast, I made one mistake because a friend bugged me many times, and I eventually gave in to be on a state panel on something that really was sort of outside of my domain, and it was a disastrous time sink. It was, and then on top of it, once the report came out, you're just getting calls right and left, and I eventually had to sort of. I don't have an assistant to answer my phone, so I stopped giving my name when I answered the phone, so I could say, "Oh, he's not here. Sorry." Call back later.
You became your own assistant.
Exactly. That's right.
Yes, last question.
Thanks very much for your presentation. My question is, why are you doing this?
Good question.
Because I wish I'd had this when I started. And actually, I had to say that the process of sitting down and thinking through what I wish I'd known 7 years ago was lovely. It's interesting. It's interesting to think what I would have done differently, and I would have done some things differently. Some things absolutely not at all. So, it's fun. I feel like the greatest gift Harvard ever gave me was my own lab. That's all I've ever wanted. My own lab. Not all I've ever wanted. I wanted children too, but it's pretty. It's pretty fantastic. So I guess it's in a way it's a little bit. Giving back?
I think for me, pretty much the same thing. I think Harvard is a tough place to navigate. I think because it's a special place. And so, my sense is I hear a lot of junior faculty or people who were junior faculty and moved on elsewhere complaining about Harvard. And I kind of also like the thing of kind of sitting down and saying, let's really think about this place. And I guess the opportunity to kind of say, the way in which you think about the next few years will have quite a significant impact on how happy you are here. And I think there are some strategies that can really make it worthwhile for you. And no one shared those with me at the beginning. So, I did make some mistakes at the beginning. And, I think if someone had said, you really don't have to do everything everyone asks you to do, that would have been tremendously helpful for me.
And I agree completely with what they're saying, and I would just add that also I'm definitely a social being, and I like getting out and meeting everybody at Harvard and just hearing what people are doing, and even getting to Cambridge. We're over at the medical area, and we don't get to hear that often. And I like doing this because I also just feel more part of the larger Harvard. And frankly, I would encourage you guys to interact, as this is hopefully setting up for you to do with other people, both because I just like hearing about what people are doing, and they're doing fascinating stuff, and some of that will be totally irrelevant for what I do in my career, and some might not. I might meet somebody that, is doing something and we come up with something interesting. But I just, the intellectual engagement here is incredible, and I think take advantage of it wherever you can. It's fun to see.
Thank you. That was a great question to end on. So we now have, and that was fabulous. We now have 15 minutes for a break and hopefully some more conversation before our tenured faculty panel. So let's just thank our panelists.